I bought my first house because I thought it would finally give me some peace. Instead, it became the only place I've ever left in the middle of the night without taking a single belonging. This happened about 4 years ago, after I accepted a better-paying job in western Pennsylvania. The company was small, and instead of renting another apartment, I decided to buy a modest house on the edge of a quiet town. It wasn't my dream home, but it was affordable, recently renovated, and only about 15 minutes from work. The previous owner had already moved across the country. Everything about the sale was surprisingly easy. The inspection came back clean. The neighbors waved when I arrived. The realtor even joked that the biggest problem I'd have was keeping deer out of the backyard. For the first week, she was right. Nothing unusual happened. I unpacked after work, ordered takeout every night, and slowly settled into a routine. The only thing that stood out was the mailbox. Every morning, I'd find it hanging open. I assumed the latch was loose until I started closing it carefully before bed. The next morning, it would be hanging open again. There was never any mail inside, just an empty box with the door swinging in the wind. One Saturday, I replaced the latch myself. The following morning, the mailbox was open again. This time, there was a folded piece of notebook paper inside. It simply said, "You checked too late yesterday." There wasn't a name, no signature. No stamp, just those 5 words. I walked across the street and asked the older couple who lived there if they'd seen anyone around my yard overnight. The husband looked confused. "What note?" When I showed him, his expression changed. Instead of reading it again, he looked at my mailbox. Then he asked a strange question. "Did you move the post?" I told him no. He nodded slowly and said the previous owner had been weird about that mailbox. Every few months, he'd repaint it, replace it, or straighten it, but he never let anyone touch the wooden post underneath. That afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a shovel. The post wasn't buried very deep. About 2 feet down, the shovel hit something solid. It wasn't concrete. It was a metal box. It had no lock. Inside was a stack of yellow envelopes. Every envelope had a year written on it: 2013. 2014, 2015, one for every year until the year before I bought the house. I opened the most recent one. Inside was a handwritten letter. If you're reading this, you already opened the mailbox after sunrise. Stop doing that. I honestly laughed. It sounded like someone playing an elaborate joke. The letter continued. Every morning before daylight, someone leaves something inside. If you wait until after the sun comes up, they know you're living here. Tomorrow morning, wake up before dawn, open the mailbox exactly once. Do not look toward the road. Do not stay outside longer than necessary. Burn this letter afterward. I read the whole thing twice. There were several more pages describing strange mornings, missing neighbors, and people who supposedly disappeared after ignoring the instructions. It sounded ridiculous. I threw everything back into the box and buried it again. That night, I forgot all about it. Until 4 in the morning. Something hit my bedroom window. Not hard, just enough to wake me. When I looked outside, nothing was there. Then I heard another soft tap. This time from the mailbox. I looked through the blinds. The mailbox door was opening and closing. Opening and closing. Even though there wasn't any wind. I watched it for almost a minute before forcing myself back into bed. The next morning, the notebook paper was gone. I searched the yard. Nothing. When I got home from work that evening, Harold, the man who lived 3 houses down, was standing in my driveway. He introduced himself and apologized for bothering me. Then he asked if I'd been outside before sunrise. I told him no. He seemed relieved. Then he quietly said something I'll never forget. "Good. They probably haven't noticed you yet." Before I could ask what he meant, he changed the subject completely and started talking about trash pickup. It was so awkward that I assumed he regretted saying anything. The following morning, I decided to test the letter. I woke up while it was still completely dark. The house felt unusually quiet, not silent. Just waiting. I walked outside carrying only a flashlight. The street lights were still on. The entire neighborhood looked asleep. I remembered the warning not to look toward the road. I smiled to myself. There was obviously nobody out there. I opened the mailbox. Inside was another folded note. Before I could read it, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy, walking on pavement. Every instinct told me to turn around. Instead, I stared into the mailbox. The footsteps stopped. Whoever it was had reached the end of my driveway. I could feel someone standing behind me, close enough that I could hear breathing. The note in my hand read only one sentence. Don't acknowledge them. I don't know why I listened. Maybe because I suddenly realized I couldn't hear birds, or traffic, or even the wind. The entire neighborhood had become unnaturally still. After what felt like a full minute, the breathing stopped. The footsteps slowly continued down the street. Only then did I turn around. Nobody was there. The street was empty. Not a single person. I checked both directions. Nothing. I hurried back inside and locked every door. That evening, I dug the metal box back up. This time, I read every letter. Each one described nearly the same pattern. The previous owner claimed someone visited the mailbox before sunrise every morning. He never actually saw the visitor because he never turned around. According to him, the only people who disappeared in town were those who looked. He even listed names. Real names. Neighbors. A mail carrier. A teenager. Someone delivering newspapers. Every one of them supposedly looked toward the road. I wanted proof the letters were fake. So after work, I searched local newspaper archives online. I expected nothing. Instead, I found 4 missing person articles. Different years, different people. Every disappearance happened before 6 in the morning, all within 2 blocks of my house. That night, I barely slept. At about 5 the next morning, I heard the mailbox again. Open, close. Open, close. This time, I stayed inside. Then my phone rang. Unknown number, I answered. No one spoke. I only heard slow breathing. Then 3 quiet knocks. Not on the phone. On my front door. I looked through the peephole. Nobody. Another 3 knocks. This time from the back door. Then from the garage door. Then from the living room window. They moved around the house one after another without any footsteps between them. It was impossible. I stood frozen until daylight. The knocking stopped the exact moment the sun rose. I called in sick and drove straight to Harold's house. When I told him everything, he didn't seem surprised. He simply asked, "Did you ever look behind you?" I said no. He sighed with relief. Then he invited me into his garage. Against the back wall were 7 old mailboxes. Different colors, different styles. Everyone had an address painted on the side. Every address belonged to a house on our street, including mine. Harold explained that every homeowner eventually removed their original mailbox and replaced it, hoping the visits would stop. They never did. The visitor always found the new one. Before I left, Harold handed me a small photograph. It showed the neighborhood sometime in the late 1970s. Every house looked almost identical, except mine. There was no house, only an empty lot. And standing exactly where my mailbox now stood was a man. He was facing away from the camera. The photo had been taken in daylight, yet his shadow stretched all the way across the road as if the sun were rising behind him. That night, I packed a suitcase. I decided I was leaving first thing in the morning. Around midnight, I heard the mailbox one last time. Open, close. Then silence. A few seconds later, someone knocked on my bedroom door, not the front door. The bedroom door. 3 slow knocks. I lived alone. I climbed out the window without making a sound, dropped into the backyard, and ran across 3 neighboring properties before calling the police. They searched the entire house. No sign of forced entry. No one inside. Nothing missing. The officer who took my statement asked why I had climbed out of the window instead of opening the bedroom door. I didn't have a good answer. I just knew I couldn't. I sold the house less than 2 months later. The buyer was another young professional relocating for work. I considered telling him everything. I even wrote him a letter. In the end, I tore it up. A year passed. Then one morning, while checking my mail at my new house nearly 200 miles away, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My mailbox door was hanging open. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper. It contained only 6 words. You finally looked at the wrong house. I found out why the house was so cheap exactly 12 hours after I got the keys. It wasn't because of the neighborhood. It wasn't because of the condition. It was because every family that had lived there eventually stopped answering their front door. Nobody ever told me that until it was too late. I bought the house in northern Ohio after accepting a promotion that required me to relocate. The place was almost perfect. It sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, backed up to a line of tall pine trees, and had just enough land that I couldn't see directly into my neighbors' yards. The previous owners had moved out quickly. According to the realtor, the husband had accepted a job overseas and they needed to sell fast. The price reflected that urgency. I didn't question it. Moving day went smoothly. By evening, most of my furniture was inside, and I was sitting on the living room floor eating takeout while watching television. Around 9 that night, someone rang the doorbell. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, there was nobody there. I stepped onto the porch and looked both ways down the street. Nothing. The neighborhood was completely quiet. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed something sitting on the welcome mat. It was a small white envelope. There wasn't a stamp or an address. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. It read, "If the bell rings after dark, never be the first person to answer." I laughed. It had to be some neighborhood prank. I crumpled the paper and tossed it into the kitchen trash. The next morning, I met my next-door neighbor while bringing out empty moving boxes. His name was Greg. He'd lived there for almost 15 years and seemed genuinely friendly. After talking for a few minutes, I mentioned the strange note. The smile disappeared from his face. Instead of asking what it said, he asked me something else. "Did you answer the first ring?" I told him I had. He looked past me toward my front porch. Then he quietly said, "Don't do that again." Before I could ask why, his wife called him from inside, and he ended the conversation almost immediately. That afternoon, I went into town for groceries. While checking out, the cashier noticed my new address on the rewards account. "You bought the Harris place?" she asked. "Yeah," she hesitated. "My brother used to deliver packages there." I waited for her to continue. "He quit that route." "Because of the dogs?" She shook her head. "They never had dogs." That was all she would say. By the time I got home, I had convinced myself everyone in town simply enjoyed making newcomers nervous. That belief lasted until my second night. At a little after 11, the doorbell rang again. One long ring. I froze. Greg's question immediately came back to me. "Did you answer the first ring?" I stayed where I was. About 30 seconds passed. Then, the bell rang again. This time I walked to the window beside the door instead of opening it. My porch was empty. No movement. No cars. No people walking away. Nothing. The third ring came almost immediately. Louder. Longer. Almost impatient, I unlocked the deadbolt without thinking. Just as my hand touched the doorknob, my phone vibrated. It was a text from an unknown number. "Do not open it after the third ring." I stared at the message. Whoever sent it had no name attached, no previous conversation. Nothing. I slowly backed away from the door. The ringing stopped. I waited nearly 10 minutes before finally checking outside. The porch was empty, but the welcome mat had been moved. Underneath it was another envelope. Inside was another handwritten note. "You're learning. Sleep upstairs tonight." That was enough. I called Greg. He answered on the first ring. Before I could explain anything, he asked, "How many?" "3. He went silent. Then he said, "Lock every window. Don't answer your bedroom door no matter what you hear." "Greg, what is going on? I'll explain tomorrow." Then he hung up. I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to footsteps downstairs. Slow, measured, walking across hardwood floors. I grabbed a baseball bat and listened. The footsteps moved through the kitchen, into the hallway, then stopped directly below my bedroom. A few seconds later, someone started climbing the stairs, one step at a time. The old wooden staircase creaked under the weight. I called the police. While whispering my address to the dispatcher, the footsteps reached the top landing. Then came 3 soft knocks. Not on the front door, on my bedroom door. I held my breath. Another 3 knocks. Then a man's voice. It sounded exactly like Greg. "Everything's okay. Open up." I didn't move. A few seconds later, the voice changed. Now it sounded exactly like my father. My father had died 6 years earlier. "Son?" My entire body locked up. The dispatcher kept asking if I was still there. I couldn't answer. The voice outside the door sighed. Then, in my own voice, it quietly said, "You should have answered the first ring." Everything went silent. The police arrived 8 minutes later. They searched every room. Every window was locked. Every door was locked from the inside. No sign of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. The officers suggested I might have been dreaming until one of them noticed muddy footprints on the upstairs hallway carpet. The prints stopped directly outside my bedroom door. There were no prints leading away. The next morning, Greg finally told me the story. Years earlier, before he'd moved into the neighborhood, an elderly woman had lived in my house. She had become convinced that someone kept ringing her doorbell every night. The police never found anyone. Eventually, she stopped answering. Then she stopped leaving the house altogether. One winter morning, a mail carrier found her sitting beside the front door. She had frozen to death. The deadbolt was still locked. She'd apparently spent the entire night waiting for whoever kept ringing. After her death, the next owner stayed less than a year. Then another family. Then another. Each one complained about the doorbell. Each one left. Except one. I asked what happened to them. Greg looked toward my house before answering. They answered the 4th ring. I asked what that meant. He shook his head. No one knows. That evening, I decided to remove the doorbell. I shut off the breaker, unscrewed the button, disconnected every wire, and pulled the entire assembly out of the wall. There was no possible way it could ring again. Just before midnight, the chime echoed through the house. Not from outside, from inside the walls. One long ring, then another, then a third. I didn't move. The 4th never came. Instead, I heard my mailbox slam shut outside. When daylight arrived, I found another envelope waiting on the porch. This one contained only a photograph. It showed my front door at night. Standing on the porch was a man wearing my clothes. His back was facing the camera. One hand was reaching toward the doorbell. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "You answered on your first night. We've only been practicing since then." I listed the house for sale the same week. It took almost 6 months to find a buyer. On closing day, I almost warned him. I truly intended to. But before I could say anything, he smiled and said, "The previous owner told me the neighbors like practical jokes." I forced a smile back and handed him the keys. 3 months later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a housewarming invitation. It was from the new owner. At the bottom, beneath his signature, he'd added one handwritten sentence. "I still haven't heard the doorbell." For a moment, I felt relieved. Then I realized something. The sentence wasn't written by the new owner. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was the same handwriting from every anonymous note I'd found on my porch. And underneath it, in smaller letters, was one final line. "Tonight will be your 4th ring." I knew something was wrong with the house before I even moved in. Not because of the inspection. Not because of the neighborhood. Because every time I visited it, one window was different. I noticed it during the second walkthrough with my realtor. The house was a small brick ranch outside Indianapolis, sitting at the end of a quiet road with only 5 other homes nearby. It had been vacant for almost a year after the previous owner passed away. According to the listing, the family lived out of state and wanted a quick sale. While the realtor unlocked the front door, I looked up at the second-floor attic window. The curtain was open. I remember it because sunlight was shining straight through it. After we finished walking through the house, I stepped outside to take a picture for my parents. The curtain was closed. I figured I had simply remembered it wrong. A week later, after my offer was accepted, I returned for the final inspection. The attic curtain was open again. I specifically pointed it out to my realtor. She looked up, frowned, and said, "I thought it was always closed." She went inside ahead of me and climbed the attic stairs. A minute later, she came back down. "It's closed," she said. I laughed. "No, it isn't." She walked outside with me. Now it was. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Finally, she shrugged and blamed it on the draft from the attic vent. It sounded reasonable enough. I moved in the following Friday. The first 2 nights were completely normal. Then, on Sunday morning, I walked outside to grab the newspaper. As I reached the driveway, I happened to glance up. The attic curtain was open. I hadn't been upstairs yet that morning. I went back inside immediately. The attic door was still locked with a small hook latch. I unlatched it and climbed the narrow wooden stairs. The attic was empty except for a few cardboard boxes left behind by the previous owners. The single round window at the front of the house had no curtain. None. Just dusty glass. I stood there for almost a minute trying to understand what I was looking at. From outside, I had clearly seen a white curtain. From inside, there was only a bare window. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought a security camera. Instead of pointing it at the front door, I mounted it inside the attic facing the window. The next morning, I checked the footage before work. Nothing. No movement, no curtain, no sounds. When I got home that evening, the camera was lying on the attic floor. Still recording. Still working. Just facing the ceiling. I assumed I hadn't tightened the mount properly, so I screwed it directly into a roof beam. There was no way it could fall again. The following morning, it was back on the floor. This time, the memory card contained something new. The recording ended at exactly 4 minutes past 3. Not because the battery died. The file simply stopped. The final frame showed the camera still attached to the beam. The next file started 47 minutes later. The camera was already on the floor. There was no footage of it falling. I watched those missing 47 minutes over and over before realizing something impossible. The timestamp hadn't skipped. Time itself hadn't advanced. The recording jumped from one frame to another as though those 47 minutes had never been captured at all. That night, I decided to stay awake. Around 3 in the morning, I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee. The house was completely silent. At exactly 4 minutes past 3, every light in the house flickered once. Then my phone buzzed. The security camera had detected motion in the attic. I was already inside the house. No one else should have been there. I opened the live feed. The attic looked empty. Then something caught my eye. The window. It now had a white curtain hanging in front of it. Slowly, very slowly, the curtain moved aside. Not from the wind, from a hand. A pale hand pulled the fabric back just enough for someone to look through. I couldn't see a face. Only one eye, watching the camera. Watching me. I sprinted upstairs. By the time I reached the attic, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear. I threw the door open. The attic was empty. No curtain. No hand. No footprints in the dust. Nothing. I checked the camera footage immediately. The notification was still there. The recorded clip lasted 12 seconds. It showed the curtain moving. The hand. The eye. Then the recording ended. I sent the clip to my brother. 5 minutes later, he called me. "What curtain?" I told him to watch it again. I did. There's nothing there. I thought he was messing with me. So I drove to his house the next day. We played the video side by side. On my phone, the curtain was there. On his, the attic was completely empty. I uploaded the clip to my computer. The curtain disappeared. I emailed it to myself. Still gone. The only place the figure appeared was on the phone that had recorded it. That evening, I knocked on my next-door neighbor's door. An older man named Walter answered. When I mentioned the attic window, he became unusually quiet. Then he asked if I had ever seen the curtain from inside the attic. I said no. He nodded slowly. Neither did the last owner. I asked him what he meant. Walter explained that the previous owner had spent months insisting someone kept watching the neighborhood from the attic window. Everyone assumed he was developing dementia. His family eventually moved him into assisted living. He died 6 months later. The house had been empty ever since. Before I left, Walter stopped me. "If the curtain never opens while you're outside," he hesitated, "don't wave." I laughed because the advice sounded ridiculous. He didn't laugh back. 3 days later, I came home from work just before sunset. As I parked, I glanced toward the attic. The curtain was open. Someone was standing behind it. Not clearly, just a dark outline. Without thinking, I raised my hand. The figure waved back. Not at the same time. A full second later. Like it had been waiting to see what I would do first. My stomach dropped. I went inside and locked every door. For the next hour, I sat in the living room trying to convince myself I had imagined the delay. Then I heard footsteps, not upstairs. Outside, walking slowly around the house. One complete circle, then another. Each lap ended beneath the attic window. I looked through the peephole. No one. The footsteps continued. Around midnight, they finally stopped. The next morning, I opened the front door. There were muddy footprints on the porch. Only one set. They came up the walkway, stopped directly in front of the door, then turned around and walked away. Except, they weren't facing away from the house. The footprints showed bare toes pointing toward my front door the entire time. Whatever had left them had walked backward all the way down the driveway. I called Walter. No answer. I walked to his house. The mailbox was overflowing. His car was gone. A neighbor across the street told me an ambulance had taken him away before sunrise. Apparently, he'd been found wandering barefoot in the middle of the road. They said he kept repeating the same sentence over and over. He waved back. I listed my house that same month. The buyers moved in during early autumn. I never told them any of this. About 6 months later, while scrolling through local community posts online, I saw a photo someone had uploaded after the season's first snowfall. It showed the neighborhood from the street. Children were building snowmen. Neighbors were talking in their driveways. Everything looked completely normal. Until I noticed the attic window of my old house. The curtain was open. Standing behind it was someone wearing the exact winter coat I had lost during the move. The photo had been taken 3 months after I left. And whoever was behind that window was waving at the camera. I almost backed out of buying the house because of one room. Not because it looked damaged. Not because it smelled strange. Because every single person who showed me the house avoided standing inside it. I didn't notice it during the first showing. There were too many people walking through at once. It was an estate sale, and the realtor was rushing everyone from room to room because there were several offers already coming in. The house itself was exactly what I wanted. It sat on the edge of a small town in North Carolina, surrounded by mature oak trees, with enough distance from the road that passing cars were barely audible. The room was at the very back of the house. It wasn't a bedroom. It wasn't an office. The blueprints called it a sitting room. It had 3 windows facing the backyard, a fireplace that had been sealed years earlier, and hardwood floors that looked almost untouched. When I stepped inside, I realized I was alone. The realtor was standing in the hallway. I asked if she'd come in for a second because I wanted to ask about the fireplace. She smiled awkwardly and said, "I'll answer from here." I remember thinking it was odd. I asked why she wouldn't come in. She laughed, but it sounded forced. "I don't know. I just don't like this room." That was her entire explanation. I bought the house anyway. Moving in took most of the weekend. By Sunday night, I had furniture in every room except the sitting room. I figured I'd turn it into a reading area once I settled in. On Monday morning, before leaving for work, I walked through the house making sure every light was off. The sitting room was empty. The windows were locked. The door was open. When I got home that evening, the door was closed. I assumed I had forgotten. The next morning, I paid attention. I opened the door completely before leaving. When I came home, it was closed again. I tested it for the next 4 days. Every morning I left it open. Every evening it was closed. There were no pets. No one else had a key. I even checked whether the house was slightly uneven and the door naturally swung shut. It didn't. If I left it halfway open, it stayed exactly where I left it. Only when I was gone all day did it somehow end up closed. That Friday, I installed a small security camera in the hallway. It pointed directly at the sitting room door. The following evening, I watched the footage. Nothing happened for hours. Then, at exactly 23 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, the camera froze. The video resumed almost 4 minutes later. The sitting room door was now closed. There was no footage showing it moving, just 4 missing minutes. I assumed the camera had glitched, so I replaced it with a different brand. The exact same thing happened. 4 missing minutes. Door closed. No explanation. That weekend, I introduced myself to my neighbor across the street. His name was Dennis. He'd lived there nearly 30 years. When I casually mentioned the sitting room door, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. Then he asked something I wasn't expecting. "Do you ever hear chairs moving?" I said no. He nodded slowly. "Good. What does that mean?" "The last owner heard them every afternoon. I asked if someone had broken into the house." He shook his head. "No. He always said it sounded like someone pulling a chair across the floor." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up thirsty. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard it. A wooden chair scraping across hardwood. Slowly. Deliberately. The sound came from the sitting room. I stood perfectly still. The scraping stopped. Then came a single soft knock. Not on the front door. Not on a wall. From inside the sitting room. I turned on every light in the hallway before opening the door. Nothing. No chair. No movement. No open windows. The room was exactly as I'd left it. Except for one thing. There was a dining chair in the middle of the room. I didn't own a dining chair. Mine hadn't been delivered yet. This chair was old. Dark oak. Its legs were worn smooth, and one of them had been repaired with a metal bracket. I stared at it for several seconds before walking closer. There was a folded piece of paper sitting on the seat. It read, "One chair is enough." I backed out of the room immediately. When daylight came, the chair was gone. I searched the entire house. Nothing. The note was gone too. I convinced myself exhaustion had gotten the better of me. Until Monday afternoon. While I was at work, my phone alerted me that the hallway camera had detected movement. I opened the live feed. The sitting room door was slowly opening. No one was visible. Then, one by one, the sounds began. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. It sounded exactly like someone dragging furniture across the floor. The camera couldn't see inside the room, only the doorway. After nearly a minute, the sound stopped. Then something rolled out into the hallway. A wooden chair leg. It stopped directly in front of the camera. I left work immediately. When I got home, there was nothing in the hallway. The room was empty. The camera footage still showed the chair leg rolling across the floor. But it wasn't there anymore. That evening, I called Dennis. He came over without hesitation. The moment he stepped inside, he looked toward the sitting room. "I've never been in there," he admitted. "You lived across the street for 30 years. "I know. Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me something the realtor never had. The original owner had lived alone. According to neighbors, he hosted a dinner every Sunday evening. The strange part was that no one ever saw guests arrive. Still, voices could always be heard inside. Laughter, conversations, glasses clinking together. Then, one winter night, the voices suddenly stopped. Police eventually entered the house after relatives requested a welfare check. They found the dining table fully set. 8 plates, 8 glasses, 8 chairs. Only one person lived there. The owner was sitting alone at the head of the table. He'd been dead for several days. Every chair except his had been pulled away from the table as though someone had just stood up. There were no fingerprints on them. The next morning, I searched county records. The story was true. The death had been reported. No explanation for the extra table settings was ever given. That night, just after midnight, I heard the scraping again. Only this time, it wasn't one chair, it was several. One after another, slowly sliding across hardwood. Then came voices, too quiet to understand. More than one, maybe 5, maybe 10. I stood outside the sitting room holding my phone. The hallway was silent. The voices were definitely coming from inside. Then someone laughed, a deep laugh, followed by another, then another. Like a room full of people reacting to a joke I'd missed. I reached for the doorknob. Before I could turn it, someone spoke clearly enough for me to understand. "We still need one more." Every voice in the room stopped at once. Then every chair scraped across the floor together. At the exact same moment, I ran. I spent the rest of the night in a motel. The following afternoon, I returned with 2 police officers. The house was empty, completely quiet. One officer walked into the sitting room while the other took notes. After less than 10 seconds, the first officer stepped back into the hallway. His face had gone pale. I asked what was wrong. He hesitated before answering. "There are fresh marks on the floor." He pointed toward the hardwood. There were long scrape marks, not random ones. 8 separate paths, each leading from the walls to an invisible dining table in the center of the room. The officers photographed everything. Neither of them offered an explanation. I sold the house 7 weeks later. The new owners never contacted me. Almost a year passed before I heard anything again. I was scrolling through social media one evening when a local photographer posted pictures from a neighborhood Christmas charity tour. One of the homes featured was my old house. The sitting room was decorated with a large holiday table. 8 chairs surrounded it. The caption underneath the photo read, "The homeowners insist they only own 7 chairs. Every Christmas morning, an 8th chair is waiting at the table." I stared at that picture for a long time. Then I noticed something no one else in the comments had mentioned. Every chair was different. Except 2. One of them had a metal bracket repairing the front leg. It was the same chair I had seen in the middle of that room on my 3rd night. The chair that disappeared before sunrise. Someone had finally decided to sit down. The first thing I noticed about the house was that it had too many keys, not copies. Different keys. The realtor handed me a heavy ring with almost 20 keys attached to it and apologized. The previous owner labeled most of them. He hadn't. Only 3 had labels. Front, garage, back. The rest were completely blank. I asked what they opened. She shrugged. We couldn't figure that out. I remember joking that the previous owner probably enjoyed collecting keys. She smiled. You'd be surprised how many people say that. I bought the house anyway. It was an older farmhouse in southern Illinois, sitting by itself at the end of a gravel road. The nearest neighbor was almost half a mile away, which was exactly what I wanted. After years of apartment living, the silence felt like a luxury. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, assembled furniture, and slowly learned the sounds of the house. Every old home settles. Floors creak. Pipes knock. None of that bothered me. What bothered me was the keys. Every morning, the key ring was somewhere different. The first time I blamed myself. I thought I'd left it on the kitchen counter. Instead, it was hanging from the hook beside the back door. The next morning, it was on the coffee table. Then it appeared on the dining room table. Then beside the upstairs bathroom sink. I lived alone. No one else had access. After the 4th morning, I started taking a picture before bed. Every night, I placed the keys on my bedside table. Every morning, they were somewhere else. The pictures proved I wasn't imagining it. I installed a small camera in my bedroom. The footage looked completely normal until exactly 2 minutes past 3. The image froze. When it resumed 5 minutes later, the keys were gone from the bedside table. There was no footage of anyone entering the room. I checked every frame. Nothing. The keys had simply disappeared, then reappeared downstairs. At work, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That afternoon, I stopped by the local hardware store to buy new locks. The man behind the counter noticed my address. You moved into the Porter house? Yeah. He nodded once. Did they leave the keys? I laughed. They sure did. His smile faded. Throw them away. I asked why. Instead of answering, he asked me another question. Have you counted them? That seemed like a strange thing to ask. No. You should. That evening, I spread the keys across the kitchen table. There were 19. I counted them 3 times. 19. The next morning, there were 20. I was absolutely certain a new key had appeared. It was older than the others, black with rust, and noticeably heavier. I convinced myself I'd simply miscounted. To be sure, I laid all 20 keys in a straight line and photographed them. The following morning, there were 21. Another unfamiliar key. This one had dried blue paint on one side. Neither of the new keys fit any lock in the house. Not the doors, not the windows, not the shed, nothing. I drove to the county records office to learn more about the property. The woman working there printed out the ownership history. The house had changed hands 7 times in the last 25 years. That seemed unusually high. I asked if she knew why. She looked over the paperwork before quietly saying, "No one stayed very long." That night I had my first visitor. At least, I thought I did. Around 1 in the morning, someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. I looked through the peephole. No one. Then someone knocked on the back door. I hurried to the kitchen. Higo! Again, no one. A third knock came from the mudroom entrance. By the time I reached it, the knocking had already stopped. When I returned to the living room, the keys were no longer on the coffee table. They were hanging from the front doorknob. I hadn't heard anyone come inside. The next morning I found another key. 22. This one had a small brass tag attached. For the first time, a label. It read, basement. The house didn't have a basement. At least, I didn't think it did. I searched every room. Nothing. Then I noticed something odd in the pantry. One section of shelving didn't quite reach the floor. It stopped about 4 inches short. When I pulled on it, the entire shelving unit swung open like a door. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading underground. Cold air rushed upward. I stood there for several seconds. The home inspection hadn't mentioned this. Neither had the realtor. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down. The stairs ended in a small concrete room. Completely empty, except for a single door. An old steel door with a heavy lock. No handle on my side. Just a keyhole. I tried every key on the ring. None fit. I started climbing back upstairs. Halfway up, I heard a metallic click below me. Like a lock turning. I looked back. The steel door was now slightly open. I was certain it had been closed. I shined my flashlight into the gap. Darkness. Nothing else. I left immediately. The next morning, there were 23 keys. The newest one was polished silver. No rust. No paint. Nothing unusual except one tiny word engraved into it. Below, I carried it downstairs. Before inserting it into the lock, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before. There were scratches around the keyhole. Hundreds of them, as if someone had repeatedly tried to unlock it in complete darkness. I slid the silver key into the lock. It fit perfectly. For a long moment, I didn't turn it. Every instinct told me to walk away. Instead, I twisted it. The lock clicked. Slowly, the steel door drifted inward by itself. The room beyond wasn't another basement. It was a hallway. Finished walls, wooden floors, framed family photographs, the exact same style as the upstairs. It looked like another house had been built beneath mine. The flashlight beam landed on one photograph hanging near the entrance. It showed a family of 4 standing on my front porch. Behind them was my house. The date written beneath the picture was almost 40 years before my house had supposedly been built. I walked farther down the hallway. Every room looked lived in. Furniture, books, children's toys. None of them covered in dust. It looked as though someone had left only hours earlier. Then I noticed the clocks. Every clock in every room showed the same time. 2 minutes past 3. From somewhere deeper inside the underground house, a door slammed. Then, footsteps. Fast, running toward me. I didn't wait to see who they belonged to. I ran back upstairs, slammed the steel door shut, and locked it. The silver key snapped in half inside the lock. The footsteps stopped on the other side. For almost a minute, someone gently tested the door handle. Then everything became quiet. I called the sheriff the next morning. 2 deputies searched the basement with me. The hidden staircase was still there. The concrete room was still there. The steel door was gone. Just a solid concrete wall. The deputies thought I'd mistaken old foundation supports for a doorway. They found nothing unusual. When they left, I stood in the empty room wondering if I'd finally lost my mind. Then I looked down. Resting on the concrete floor was my key ring. I picked it up. There were only 3 keys left. Front. Garage. Back. The other 20 had disappeared. I sold the house 6 months later. Last winter, I received a Christmas card from the family who bought it. There was a smiling picture of them standing on the front porch. Behind them, through the living room window, I noticed a key rack mounted on the wall. I zoomed in on the photo. Hanging from the rack were 23 keys. I wasn't the first person to move into the house that month. At least, that's what the electricity company told me. I'd just finished unpacking when I called to transfer the utilities into my name. The representative asked me to confirm the address, typed for a few seconds, then said something that made me stop unpacking. "So, you're replacing the last tenant?" I told her I had bought the house. She paused. "Our record shows someone activated service there 9 days ago." I laughed and assumed it was a clerical mistake. There hasn't been anyone living there. She apologized and said she'd correct it. I forgot about the conversation until that evening. I was carrying empty boxes into the garage when I noticed muddy footprints leading across the driveway. They weren't coming toward the house, they were leaving it. Bare footprints, adult-sized. They started at the garage door and continued toward the street before disappearing on the pavement. There were no footprints leading back. I checked the security camera I'd installed over the garage. Nothing. The driveway had been empty all day. The footprints simply appeared. The next morning, I found a half-empty bottle of orange juice in my refrigerator. I lived alone. I hadn't bought orange juice. I threw it away, assuming the movers had somehow left it behind. That night, I made a point of checking every room before bed. Every window was locked. Every closet was empty. I even looked under the beds. Nothing. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up because I heard the shower running, not dripping. Running. I grabbed my phone and walked toward the bathroom. The sound stopped just before I reached the hallway. The bathroom was dry. The towels were exactly where I'd left them. The shower floor hadn't been used. I stood there for almost a minute. Then I noticed something in the mirror. Written in the steam that wasn't there. "You missed him again." I blinked. The words were gone. The mirror was completely clear. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following afternoon, I introduced myself to the woman living next door. Her name was Michelle. After a few minutes of casual conversation, I mentioned hearing water running in the house. She stared at me for a second before asking, "Have you started finding food yet?" I thought she was joking. "What?" The previous owner kept complaining that groceries disappeared. I laughed. "I found orange juice." Her expression didn't change. "He always found milk." That answer stayed with me all day. On my way home from work, I bought a marker. Before putting anything into the refrigerator, I wrote today's date on every bottle and container. The next morning, the dates were gone, not wiped off. Gone. The marker ink had completely disappeared. Only from the food, nothing else. I tested it again. This time, I placed a strip of clear tape across the refrigerator door before going to bed. If someone opened it, the tape would tear. The tape was still intact the next morning. But the orange juice I had bought the day before was half empty. I set up a camera inside the kitchen facing the refrigerator. The footage was normal until exactly 12 minutes after 3. The picture froze. When it resumed 4 minutes later, the refrigerator door was closed. Nothing looked unusual until I checked the timestamp. The camera had recorded continuously. There wasn't a single missing second. Yet 4 minutes had somehow passed between 2 consecutive frames. That evening, I searched online for the previous owner. His obituary appeared almost immediately. He died from a heart attack inside the house. The article mentioned he had lived alone, but one line caught my attention. He was survived by his twin brother. There was no mention of where the brother lived. I called the realtor the next morning. She sounded uncomfortable the moment I asked about him. The brother visited once after the funeral. Did he ever have a key? I don't think so. Think? She hesitated. He knew the house very well. That night I stayed awake in the living room. At exactly 16 minutes after 3, the kitchen light turned off by itself. I hadn't touched the switch. Then I heard the refrigerator open. I couldn't see into the kitchen from where I was sitting. Only hear it, the soft clink of bottles. A drawer sliding open, plastic packaging. Someone moving around comfortably, like they knew exactly where everything was. I picked up the fireplace poker and slowly walked toward the kitchen. The sounds stopped. The refrigerator door closed. When I turned the corner, no one was there. The refrigerator light was off. Everything looked normal, except a bowl of cereal was sitting on the table. Milk, spoon, everything. I hadn't made it. The milk carton I had marked that morning was now almost empty. Beside the bowl was a folded napkin. I unfolded it. It read, "You buy better groceries than he did." I ran outside and called the police. 2 officers searched the property for over an hour. No signs of forced entry. No hidden doors. No attic access. No crawl space large enough for a person. One of the officers asked if anyone else had ever lived with me. I said no. As they were leaving, the younger officer stopped at the front porch. He looked back at the house. "Who's upstairs?" My stomach dropped. "There isn't anyone upstairs. I thought I saw someone looking out the window." We both looked up. The window was empty. The officers checked again. Nothing. The next day, I went to City Hall and requested the original building plans. The clerk disappeared into the archives for almost 20 minutes. When she returned, she looked confused. "The plans don't match." "What do you mean?" "The house was approved with 4 bedrooms. It has 3. She turned the blueprint toward me. There was another bedroom. According to the plans, it should have been directly above my kitchen. There wasn't any room there now. Just an empty section of attic. That evening, I climbed into the attic with a flashlight. Sure enough, one wall looked newer than the rest. Fresh lumber, different insulation. Someone had built a false wall. I pushed against it. It moved. Behind it was a narrow room. Just large enough for a bed, a chair, a small dresser. Everything was covered in dust. Except the bed. The blanket had been folded recently. There was a fresh glass of water on the nightstand. Still cold. I backed out immediately and called the police again. This time they arrived within minutes. The hidden room was exactly where I'd described it. But it was empty. No bed. No chair. No dresser. No glass of water. Just bare plywood and insulation. One officer asked if I was sure I hadn't mistaken another part of the attic. Before I could answer, the older officer pointed his flashlight toward the floor. There were footprints, only one set. Bare feet. They led from the hidden room, across the attic, and ended at the solid brick chimney. There was nowhere else to go. The footprints simply stopped. I moved out 3 days later. The house sold the following spring. I never drove past it again. About 8 months later, I received an email from the new owner. He had found some mail addressed to me. He asked for my new address so he could forward it. Attached was a picture of the envelopes lying on his kitchen counter. I wasn't looking at the mail. I was looking at the refrigerator behind him. There was a shopping list held up by a magnet. The handwriting wasn't his. At the bottom of the list, beneath eggs, bread, coffee, and milk, someone had written one final item. "Remember to buy enough for both of us." I never should have trusted the seller when he told me there was only one key to the house. Because 6 nights after I moved in, I watched someone unlock my front door with another one. This happened 2 years ago after I bought a small house outside of Eugene, Oregon. It wasn't a new home, but it had been renovated recently and everything looked solid. During closing, the previous owner slid a single brass key across the table and said, "That's the only copy." I asked if he was sure. He smiled. I made certain of it. At the time, I appreciated the honesty. Looking back, I realized he answered too quickly. The first few days were completely normal. I unpacked, met a few neighbors, and settled into a routine. Every morning before leaving for work, I locked the front door and tested it twice. Every evening it was still locked. Then, on the 6th night, I came home and noticed the deadbolt was already unlocked. The knob was still locked. Just not the deadbolt. I assumed I'd forgotten. The next morning I paid close attention. I locked both locks. Pulled on the handle. Everything was secure. When I got home, the deadbolt was unlocked again. Nothing inside the house had been disturbed. My laptop was still on the desk. Cash was still in the kitchen drawer. Nothing appeared to be missing. I bought a new smart lock the next day. It kept a log every time the deadbolt was used. That night, I checked the app before bed. One lock. One unlock. Exactly as expected. The following afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was at work. Front door unlocked. I opened the app immediately. The lock history showed an unlock at exactly 12 minutes after 1. Then, another notification appeared. Front door locked. Someone had unlocked it, then locked it again. The app didn't identify the user. It simply recorded the action. I rushed home. Nothing looked different. I checked every room, every closet, the attic, the crawl space. No one. The only thing that caught my attention was a mug sitting in the sink. It hadn't been there that morning. I lived alone. I washed it before leaving. There was fresh coffee residue inside. I hadn't made coffee. The next morning I walked next door to introduce myself to an older man named Bill. When I casually mentioned someone getting into my house, he didn't seem surprised. Instead, he asked, "Did you replace the locks? I installed a smart lock yesterday." He nodded. "Good." Then he looked at my front door for several seconds before quietly adding, "Did you replace the key cylinder?" I hadn't. I didn't even know that was different from replacing the lock. Bill sighed. "The last owner didn't either. What happened to him? He stayed about 3 months. Did someone break in?" Bill shook his head. He could never prove anyone had. That answer didn't help. The next day, I hired a locksmith. He removed the entire lock assembly and replaced every component, including the cylinder. Before leaving, he asked to see the old key. When I handed it to him, he frowned. "This isn't an original." "What do you mean?" "This key was copied from another one." I asked if that mattered. He shrugged. "Only if you don't know where the original is." That night, I slept better than I had in days. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of metal scraping outside. Not loud. Just the sound of a key sliding into a lock. I looked at the security camera on my phone. A man was standing on my porch. His face was hidden beneath a baseball cap. He inserted a key into the lock. Turned it. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. After a few seconds, he stepped back. Instead of leaving, he looked directly into the camera. Then slowly raised his right hand and pointed toward the upstairs window. I turned around instinctively. There was someone standing inside my bedroom. I stumbled backward and hit the dresser. When I looked again, the room was empty. I grabbed the baseball bat beside my bed and searched every room. Nothing. By the time I checked the front camera again, the man on the porch was gone. Police arrived 20 minutes later. They searched the property. One officer found footprints leading away from the porch. They stopped in the middle of my front yard. No footprints continued beyond that point. The investigating officer asked if I had enemies. I laughed. "I just moved here." He nodded. "Then somebody knows this house better than you do." The following weekend, I decided to search every inch of it. I measured closets, tapped walls, checked under the stairs. Everything matched the blueprints except one thing. The hallway upstairs measured almost 3 feet longer than it should have. That meant there was empty space inside one wall. I borrowed a stud finder from Bill. It showed something strange. The wall wasn't empty. It contained a narrow cavity running almost the entire length of the hallway. There should have been no space there. I removed one section of drywall. Behind it was a wooden passage barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. The passage connected every bedroom. There were small viewing openings hidden behind the air vents. Someone inside the passage could see into every room. My stomach turned. Near the entrance sat a folding chair, a flashlight, several empty water bottles, and a key. Not just any key. The original brass key to my front door. It was attached to a faded keychain shaped like a blue fish. Beside it was a spiral notebook. Every page contained dates. Keynotes. Notes. Lights off at 10. Leaves for work at 7. Orders pizza Fridays. Sleeps with bedroom window opened. Hundreds of entries. The final page had been written the day before. Installed new lock. Need another way in. I left the notebook exactly where it was and called the police. This time, they treated it very differently. Crime scene investigators photographed everything. Fingerprints were collected. DNA samples were taken. The hidden passage extended from the attic all the way down to a concealed exit beneath the back porch. Whoever had built it had planned it from the beginning. The detective later told me something I wish I'd never heard. The previous owner hadn't built the passage. It had existed since the house was constructed more than 50 years earlier. Every owner thought they were the first to discover it. None of them were. Because someone kept using it. A week later, the police arrested a man living in another county. He had worked for a construction company that built houses throughout the area decades earlier. His fingerprints matched the notebook. The case should have been over, except one detail never made sense. The detective called me after the arrest. There were 2 sets of fingerprints in the passage. Who did the second set belong to? We don't know. They weren't his? No. Then whose were they? He was quiet for several seconds. They were fresh. I asked if they matched a previous homeowner. He said no. They didn't match anyone in the national database. A month later, I sold the house. I never wanted to see it again. Almost a year passed before I received an envelope from the county prosecutor. Inside was a letter informing me that the suspect had died in jail before trial. Natural causes. The case was officially closed. There was also a property inventory listing everything recovered from his storage unit. One item made my hand start shaking. A large key cabinet containing copies of house keys. There were more than 200 of them. Next to each key was an address. My old house was listed. So were dozens of other homes across 3 counties. One address wasn't crossed off. It was my current house. I'd lived there for almost 11 months. I walked to the front door without taking my eyes off the paper. Sticking out of the outside lock was a brass key with a blue fish keychain. I bought the house because it had no history. That was exactly how the realtor described it. Brand new construction. You're the first owner. After everything I'd heard about older houses, hidden damage, and strange stories people like to tell, a brand new place sounded perfect. No previous owners. No family tragedies. No mystery. Just fresh paint and empty rooms. That turned out to be the biggest lie anyone told me. The first thing I noticed after moving in was that my address didn't exist, not officially. Packages kept getting returned. Food delivery drivers called saying they couldn't find the house. One driver even apologized because his GPS stopped about 200 feet before my driveway. It says the road ends here, he told me over the phone. I stood on my porch looking directly at his car. He was parked at the entrance to my street. He couldn't see me. I waved. Nothing. I walked toward him. The moment I reached the end of my driveway, he suddenly looked up. "Oh," he said. "There you are." I asked why he hadn't seen me standing on the porch. He frowned. I didn't. I let it go. GPS mistakes happen. A week later, I ordered a new couch. The delivery company called while I was at work. They couldn't complete the delivery because, according to them, the house wasn't there. I left work early and met them at the entrance to the neighborhood. The driver showed me his tablet. The map displayed every house on my street, except mine. There was just an empty lot where my property should have been. I laughed nervously and pointed across the road. You can literally see it. Both delivery workers turned toward my house. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, one of them quietly asked, "When was that built?" "It was finished 3 months ago." He shook his head. "I drive this route every week." He looked genuinely unsettled. "I've never seen that house before." That night, I searched county property records. My address appeared. Everything seemed normal. Then I searched old satellite images. The newest image showed my house. The image from the previous year also showed my house. That didn't make sense. Construction had only finished a few months earlier. I searched an even older image. The house was still there. Different landscaping, different paint, same structure. According to satellite photos, the house had existed for at least 8 years. I convinced myself the online dates were wrong until my neighbor knocked on my door. His name was Evan. He introduced himself and welcomed me to the neighborhood. During the conversation, he casually asked, "So, did they finally finish rebuilding it?" I stared at him. "What do you mean rebuilding?" He looked confused. "The fire." "There wasn't a fire." He frowned. "I watched it burn." He pointed toward my living room. The roof collapsed right about there. Every hair on my arm stood up. I asked when this happened. "About 6 years ago." I showed him pictures from the listing. Brand new construction, fresh concrete, new framing. He slowly shook his head. "That's the same house. I barely slept that night." The next morning, I searched local newspaper archives. Nothing. No fire. No insurance claim. No mention of my address. It was as though the event had never happened. After work, I decided to explore the crawl space beneath the house. The access panel was inside the garage. When I opened it, I immediately noticed something strange. The wooden beams looked old, much older than the house. Some of them were blackened, as though they had once burned. I crawled deeper. Near the center of the foundation, I found a section of concrete that looked newer than everything around it. Someone had poured it by hand, not professionally. Just enough to cover something. Sticking out of one corner was a melted brass house number. It wasn't my address. It was a completely different one. I took a picture and searched it online. No results. Not even on old maps. That evening, someone knocked on my front door. A man in his 60s stood on the porch holding a small cardboard box. He asked if I had just moved in. When I said yes, he handed me the box. "I've been trying to return this." "Return what?" "It keeps showing up on my porch." Inside the box were photographs. Every one of them showed my house. Different years. Different families. Different cars in the driveway. The oldest photo was nearly 20 years old. The newest one showed me unloading the moving truck. Someone had taken it from across the street. I asked who he got the box from. He shrugged. "It just appears." I laughed nervously. He didn't. Before leaving, he said something that stayed with me. "Don't answer if someone asks how long you've lived here." I wanted to ask why. But he'd already walked away. 3 nights later, I got my answer. Around midnight, there was another knock. When I opened the door, a woman I'd never seen before stood on the porch. She looked completely normal, maybe in her 40s. She smiled politely. "How long have you lived here?" I remembered the neighbor's warning. Instead of answering, I asked if she needed help. She smiled again. "How long?" Something about the way she asked it felt rehearsed, like she already knew the answer. I said I was sorry and closed the door. The moment the lock clicked, she knocked again, exactly 3 times. I looked through the peephole. She was gone. The next morning, there was a photograph taped to my front door. It showed my porch from the night before. I was standing in the doorway talking to the woman. Except, from the camera's angle, there was no woman. I was speaking to empty air. I decided to install cameras covering every side of the house. For several days, nothing happened. Then one morning, I reviewed the footage before leaving for work. At exactly 5 minutes before 4, every camera recorded the same thing. Someone walked out of my front door. The cameras never showed them entering. Only leaving. The person wore my clothes, my jacket, my shoes, my baseball cap. The figure walked to the edge of the driveway, stopped, turned toward the house, and waved, then simply disappeared between one frame and the next. I called the police. They reviewed the footage. The officer looked at me strangely. "I don't see anyone." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean? The driveway's empty." He turned the monitor toward me. On his screen, there was nothing. On mine, the figure was still standing there waving. That afternoon, I drove to City Hall again. This time, an older employee overheard me asking about my address. He quietly pulled me aside. Without saying a word, he opened an old paper map from decades earlier. He pointed to the exact place where my house now stood. There wasn't a home marked there. There wasn't even a lot. Just 2 handwritten words. Reserved property. "No owner?" I asked. He shook his head. "It was never sold." "What was it reserved for?" He slowly folded the map. "No one's ever been able to answer that. I moved out less than a month later." The house sold quickly. Almost a year passed before I thought about it again. I was driving through the area on business and decided to see whether the new owners had changed anything. I turned onto the street. My house was gone, not demolished. Not under construction. Gone. There was only an empty grassy lot. The neighboring houses were exactly where they had always been. I parked and walked to the edge of the property. The mailbox was still there. Everything else had vanished. An elderly man walking his dog noticed me staring. He asked if I was looking for someone. I pointed at the lot. "The house that used to be here." He looked at me with a puzzled expression. "There hasn't been a house there in over 20 years. I laughed because I genuinely thought he was joking. Then he pointed toward the mailbox. "If you're thinking about building there," he paused, "don't use the old address." I looked down. The mailbox door was hanging open. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. It read, "We'll let you find us again."